All right. Hello, this is Christian Idealism, and today I have a very, very, very special two guests on. His name is Josh Rasmussen and then Philip Goff. A lot of people have been looking forward to this discussion. The topic is on the nature of the cosmic mind or cosmic consciousness, whatever you want to call it. This is going to be an informal discussion. This is not a debate. We're just going to go over different views in the philosophy of religion and especially the philosophy of mind, talking about consciousness, all that good stuff. So, I know, Josh, you agreed to go first, so you can start off.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I've also been really looking forward to this discussion. I mean, it's so interesting, Philip, because I discovered your work online. I saw some articles, some of them that you actually just sent us through email. And it was just very interesting and exciting to discover these things because I feel like you're articulating in a language of contemporary philosophy some trends that I'm seeing, maybe a strange sort of convergence toward maybe a new understanding of the world in terms of mentality being deeper in the fabric of nature than people have perhaps anticipated. And kind of before I lay out a few of my own motivations in joining this kind of convergence, I just wanted to highlight some aspects of the convergence that I'm seeing. So it's interesting to me in near-death experience reports. I've seen maybe a few thousand of these. I'm just kind of interested in collecting these stories, these anecdotes of people reporting like the experience of leaving their body and then having some kind of encounter with a greater consciousness or greater being. And what I've noticed is that even though these come from many different cultures and people will interpret their experiences through the lens of their culture, so there's some differences there, there's some interesting convergence that even contradicts their own anticipations. So you have people from certain religious frames who I've seen them report that their experience contradicted their own frame. And so it broke them out of that frame. And then you have people from certain non-religious frames and have an experience that breaks them out of that frame as well. And so it's almost like people from different parts of the world are experiencing maybe a greater vision of the world. And I feel like there's something interesting that's happening in the study of consciousness. So I just want to say, like, in my own journey of inquiry, I feel like my view has been moved towards thinking of original consciousness as more integrated into the world, more immanent. And we can talk about that later, but like that the world itself is in a sense like an artifact of this original consciousness, not the consciousness is sort of external and produces something else that can exist sort of on its own in a standalone way. And I find actually a number of like philosophers coming from a theistic standpoint are kind of finding their way toward a more immanent conception of original consciousness. And then on the same or on the other side of things, I see philosophers who maybe their initial worldview has been to think of consciousness as emerging sort of later out of unconscious or completely mindless, categorically different sorts of things. And then their inquiries, Philip Goff, you being one of them, Donald Hoffman being another coming from a very scientific perspective, Bernardo Kastrup being another one, who seem to be arriving at this original consciousness that's still immanent in nature, but deeper into the fabric of nature than they might have initially expected. And so there's this weird way in which I see philosophers from different viewpoints coming to an interesting convergence, but we have different vocabulary for describing it. And so there's almost an illusion of distinction. I'm not saying there aren't distinctions. I think there are some interesting distinctions, but I think there's a lot more convergence than is being recognized so far. And one of the things I'm interested in is helping to display the convergence, some of this unity of understanding in terms of a kind of mind first ontology. So that's kind of an opening remark on sort of my motivation. And then I can share some thoughts about sort of how I've come to think of mind as fundamental. But I don't know, Philip, if you want to comment on anything so far.
Yeah, just briefly, I suppose that is really interesting. I suppose there has been also my experience in analytic philosophy of religion. I know there's been a kind of a resurgence of interest in pantheism and panentheism.
Mm-hmm.
People like Andrei Bukharev and Joanna Leidenhag, who there was recently actually a volume of essays responding to my book Galileo's Error by philosophers, scientists, but also by theologians.
Yeah.
And Joanna was one of those contributors, and she has a forthcoming book on a kind of panpsychic Christianity, which I'm gonna there's gonna be a symposium on that I'm looking forward to contributing to. So yeah, I suppose I guess I hadn't sort of put the two together, but there does seem to be a good volume on alternative conceptions of God by Andre and Eugen Nagasawa.
Yep.
So I guess now you mention it, yeah, there has been accompanying the same time there's been a resurgence of interest in panpsychism, in philosophy of mind. There has also been a resurgence of interest to a sort of God being less distinct from the universe, perhaps a conception of God where God fills out the universe in some way.
Yeah, more integrated within it.
I've just updated the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on panpsychism that I'm hoping to finally submit, massively overdue this week. And yeah, Joanna actually suggested doing a section on theological implications, but I haven't got around to it this time, unfortunately. But I think that would definitely be something good to add on some future occasion.
Yeah, well, it's also just interesting, the vocabulary. So I'm part of this naturalism Facebook group. Galen Strawson is in there and others, and it's fascinating to see the sort of definitions of naturalism put forward, because I'm thinking, okay, I accept those definitions. I think reality is natural through and through on those definitions. But then there's this characterization of those who are believing in some kind of mind that's not natural. But it's fascinating to me because it looks to me that there's a little bit of a translation problem, maybe a little bit of talking past each other. So in my dialogue with Felipe Leon on Is God the Best Explanation of Things, one of my discoveries was seeing that on his own use of the term natural, I actually do think the fundamental reality is natural, and that all reality is sort of in the same category, in the sense that you can investigate it scientifically. It's not a categorically different stuff or kind as the rest of things. The only real difference would just be perhaps that you're carving away limits or boundaries or particularities, but these aren't like differences in fundamental category. And so it's interesting to just see how even some of the distinctions, I feel like, are just in terms of people using language differently or having concepts that are different. And
yeah, I mean, I have an ongoing perennial argument with Galen Strawson, who was my PhD supervisor, actually, over like how we should define the word materialism or physicalism, for example. And actually, the volume I just mentioned, this was his contribution again, shouting at me over this. But I mean, I tend to think it's better to define both materialism and naturalism actually in a more divisive way, just because you want the sides of the debate. And if it turns out almost everyone's a naturalist, then you need a name for. So I tend to use the word naturalism to mean like the fundamental level of reality has no value, at least no value involving facts or no teleology and stuff, just so you can have a debate about that. And then I tend to use physicalism such that the fundamental nature of reality can be captured entirely in the terms of physical science. Again, just so we can kind of have the debate. Whereas, Galen likes to define things so liberally that we all end up on the same team. But
well, that's how my co-author Felipe defined it. He had this liberal naturalism, which allows value to be fundamental, and the arrow of teleology to be fundamental as well. But that's interesting, because if you define naturalism to preclude that, then would you say that you're not a naturalist in that sense? Do you think value is fundamental?
I guess so. Yeah, I guess. I guess that is an implication. I hadn't really thought that through, but I tend to use these words mostly for PR purposes and think, what's going to cut through to a given audience and maybe make them sort of have a little bit of an alternative perspective. So maybe if some people are going to be opened up to a certain view by using the naturalism or not alienated from it, or I think use them in sort of provocative ways to sort of get people to look at things in a slightly different way. I tend to use the word physicalism more than naturalism, but haven't used the word
Well,
naturalism
I
for a
mean,
long
even that
time.
word physical, I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about this more later here, but the way that you use the term physical, it occurs to me that something can be physical and it can be fundamentally conscious. It occurs to me that the base reality could be physical, and I'm like looking for, is there any substantive disagreement in how you're describing the base of reality when you use the term physical, and the things that I want to say about the base of reality. And it doesn't seem to me that the difference is going to turn over whether we call it physical or not, but that maybe there are other differences in terms of how much power it has, perhaps. Although even there, I'll be curious to explore that with you because, I'll save that for later in the discussion.
Well, why don't you, Josh? Why don't you? Well, I don't know
Yeah,
if Kyle wanted to come in, but
this might be a good time to sort of lay out the views. So maybe Josh, you can present your view. What do you think about the nature of the cosmic mind? And then Philip, you can present your view afterwards.
Okay, yeah.
Sounds
So
good.
I would say the sort of basic way of describing my view would be that there is a fundamental reality from which other things depend and unfold, and that this fundamental reality has powers of a mind. It can direct reality in certain ways. This can help explain the fine-tuning of the cosmos, leading to interesting complexity, like us. It can also help predict and explain the emergence of other kinds of beings who can think rationally, can reflect, and even have a moral sense or sense of value. It's not that there aren't other possible ways of explaining this, but that if the root of reality has a kind of power of intention or power of direction, that seems to raise the probability that you would get beings like us. And then next, it seems like a simple description. I was thinking about this again this morning, that a simple description of fundamental reality is that it's purely positive in the sense that all of its attributes are value making or value entailing, and none of them are value subtracting or value detracting. So if I already have reason to think that it has the sort of valuable properties of a mind, it has the valuable properties of being able to be a foundation of the rest of reality, then it seems like a nice, initially simple characterization. It's purely positive or it's purely valuable. So that then if it does have particular limits or boundaries within its nature, there would need to be some kind of deeper explanation to account for those limits and boundaries. And actually, I thought maybe this principle could be at work, Philip, in your own thinking too, because in your article, I loved your article. I just thought it was fantastic. I mean, I'm not just saying that. I was reading this. I thought this is very cool. This is very beautiful. And one of the points that you made there was in an argument for the goodness of this sort of fundamental layer was that if it were sort of negative, it was like an evil being, that would be a kind of maybe departure that would require some deeper explanation. And if I understood that right, I mean, I think that's how I'm thinking of it, that any kind of sort of breaks or boundaries or limits or departures would require some further explanation, or at least that an initially simple hypothesis would be that it's sort of purely positive, purely all of its features are great making or value making. And so then from there, and this will point to, I think, a possible difference between us, although I'm going to want to explore this with you, is that this makes my hypothesis kind of risky because it's predictively very powerful. I think a lot of its predictions are successful, so it successfully predicts that fundamental reality has powers. It has even intentional powers. It's good because it's purely positive. But then also that the rest of reality has to sort of be compatible with this purely positive initial reality. And you might think that, well, there's problems in the world, there's negative features of the world that seem to sort of not be in line with that very positive vision of the initial reality. So in that sense, I do think that my theory opens itself up to this kind of risk of being too predictively powerful. And so we can talk about, that aspect of the theory. But I would say that that's kind of an outline of how I'm thinking of fundamental reality. And I mentioned one sort of pathway to that view for me is thinking about what's the sort of simplest explanation of other things that I observe in the world. And so I'm thinking of this sort of purely positive characterization, or at least minimally a mental characterization of fundamental reality, as providing resources to predict other things that I observe. Another path is more of this sort of explanatory gap path from Chalmers and others. And I've actually kind of put this in my own work in terms of a construction problem. So I think it's possible to see that certain kinds of constructions are just impossible. Like, for example, we can't take a bunch of numbers and then construct a person out of numbers. If I can concentrate on my visual images, if I organize those visual images into a certain kind of pattern, maybe it's the pattern of a brain in my own imagination, that pattern of visual imagery in my own imagination won't be conscious itself. Like, I'll be conscious of it, but it won't have its own consciousness or its own thoughts, because I think that there's a sort of construction error or construction incongruity between that kind of thing and then a conscious thing. And so I didn't used to think this so much before, but as I've been thinking more about consciousness, it's striking me as just actually impressive that any consciousness could come out of purely geometric entities, in the way that it would seem impressive that a visual image in my own mind could itself be a conscious being that can have its own thoughts. It's like merely taking cosmic debris and organizing it in different patterns strikes me as sort of the wrong kind of material for making consciousness. So it seems like there's got to be something more. And that leads me to think that the more is not built up out of mindless bits, but instead sort of mentality is the original ingredient. Now, sometimes people will respond to me and say, well, then how do you explain matter in terms of mind if you can't get mind out of matter? And my answer to that is, well, I actually think that quantum field theory and my own analysis of sort of what it means to be material can be explained in terms of conscious elements. And anyway, that opens up a whole nother project. That's not a trivial thing I'm saying there, but I do think there are more resources for explaining matter in terms of mind than mindless matter, explaining mind in terms of mindless matter. All right, so I've said a lot there, but there's a lot of my cards on the table for you to pick up and turn over or throw away, or whatever you want to do with my cards.
Brilliant. Thanks, Josh. That was really great. So, yeah, maybe I could just say two things maybe about possible sources of disagreement. So one that I'm not sure whether we agree or disagree. I think from what you've said, maybe we might agree quite a lot. And another that I feel more confident we will disagree on. Maybe I'll start with the bit we will disagree on, which you've already hinted at. So yes, I'm not entirely. I'm just somewhat sympathetic to your argument, to these kinds of arguments that the omni-god kind style mind is a very simple hypothesis. I think Richard Swinburne in his book The Existence of God defends this quite well, and you yourself in your own work. So the idea that if you've got all these qualities to the max, then this is in a way incredibly simple. It's much more. I mean, physicists often say that the two simplest values are 0 and infinity. Anything in between, it's like, as you say, why is it exactly there? Why is it exactly there? Much simpler to be 0 or infinity. So in that sense, a mind that just has infinite of all the properties is very simple. But I think the relevant theoretical imperative here is believe the simplest hypothesis that can account for the data. It's not believe the simplest hypothesis. The simplest hypothesis is nothing exists. It's believe the simplest hypothesis consistent with the data. So, I mean, Richard Swinburne has a nice example regarding the speed of light. I've never checked this out, actually. I assume he's right about this, but he says that before we had evidence to the contrary, the default assumption was that the speed of light was infinite. It just instantaneously gets from A to B. And then but then we get empirical evidence to the contrary, and we move from that default simple hypothesis to a finite value. So I guess I think yeah, maybe you're right that the omnigod mind is, in some sense, the default assumption. If we're talking about some kind of mind, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
before we get to the evidence. But then I think very strongly that the evidence requires a slightly less simple hypothesis, namely the evidence of evil and suffering. So I guess I don't find it plausible at all that an all-powerful loving being would create a universe like this. So the familiar problem. So we could talk about that. So then, so my suggestion on that basis, assuming we're going to need some kind of mind to account for fine tuning, which I'm somewhat sympathetic to. I'm kind of agnostic. I'm actually open to. So this paper that you were talking of, I do defend a foundational mind explaining fine tuning, but I'm open to other possibilities, like Thomas Nagel in Mind and Cosmos from 2012 defended sort of natural teleology. So there isn't a mind at the base there. There's sort of fundamental laws of nature with kind of purposes built into them. So I'm open to that possibility as well. I'm actually just started last week a book on this topic, on the purpose of existence, and thinking about teleology and how to account for that. Anyway, but insofar as we're going to account for something like the fine tuning with a foundational mind, I would have it that it's a mind with limited powers in order to account for the evil and suffering. So this might be a little bit less simple than your foundational mind, but I think it could still be pretty simple. So again, the analogy might be, sorry.
It's the next best
Yeah,
hypothesis.
it might be pretty simple. And I think, that's what we should do. We should look at the data and look at the simplest hypothesis compatible with the data. So, for example, it could be a mind that is only able to create a university from a singularity. So can't just, and mind that would love to just create intelligent life from ex nihilo, create Adam by breathing into the dust, but just can't create complexity like that. Can only create from total simplicity. That would be a very simple power, actually, now I think about, that you could just create from a singularity, and is limited in the kind of universe she can create. She can only create a universe with the kind of with the form of physics we find in the actual world. What do I mean by the form of physics? Just take physics and take all the numbers out. Maybe the foundational mind is limited to creating that kind of universe. So the only way the foundational mind is able to create intelligent life is by creating a universe from a singularity with the right kind of constants that will eventually evolve intelligent life. And the foundational mind is like, oh no, I hate that the suffering and the horrific suffering that's going to come with that, but it's either that or nothing. And it's better to have that. So I think that's still a pretty simple hypothesis. It's not like really lots of ad hoc, it's pretty simple. And so that's one big thing. I think that's probably the point we'll most disagree on. That might be interesting to talk about. But then the other thing to explore, I suppose, is just, I might write a paper on this, actually. So I was thinking, if you're driven by, here's the way I've been thinking about it recently, partly reading your stuff and thinking about this stuff. If we're driven by the kind of simplicity considerations that yourself and Swinburne are attracted to, then yes, it's nice to have this very simple mind at the bottom, but I think it's more parsimonious to have the foundational mind become the universe rather than create a physical universe distinct from it, because then you've just got one kind of thing. And in line with what you just said, I think that is actually very easy to do. Very, the way I often explain panpsychism now, I think I say it's impossible, really hard, probably impossible to get consciousness out of physics, but it's really easy to get physics out of consciousness. And the reason is that physics is purely mathematical. Just numbers, functions, sets. You just get this kind of abstract mathematical structure. So there's a couple of ways one can react to that fact. You can follow Max Tegmark and say, well, maybe the physical world at base is kind of made up of mathematics, made up of numbers, sets, and functions and stuff. Maybe not sets. Or an alternative is to say, well, maybe there's something underlying that mathematical structure. There's something that the mathematical structure is the structure of Steve. We could bring up Stephen Hawking's great line that the final theory will just be a bunch of equations and won't tell you what breathes fire into the equation, makes the universe for them to describe. So if the foundational mind has in its experience, it realizes those mathematical structures that are identified by physics, then I think we can say the foundational mind is the universe. So if we say the universe, the physical universe is the thing that has the mathematical structures identified by physics, and if the thing that has the mathematical structures identified by physics is the foundational mind, then we can say the foundational mind is the universe. So, if we're just trying to account for fine-tuning, just finally, we could just say it's a contingent mind that came into existence at the Big Bang. But if you're more inclined by kind of cosmological argument type considerations, then you could say this is a timeless necessary entity that became the physical universe, just as a child becomes an adult, or we have this phrase in philosophy, phase sortals. A thing. Maybe child adult isn't the best analogy. It's not necessarily the foundational mind growing up or something, but changing phase.
Yeah.
It was perhaps, to speak a bit loosely, you can't talk about was when we're talking about before time, but speaking loosely, was timeless. But then, I guess in the way Christians think about Jesus, something that was timeless that became a physical entity. Anyway, so I think maybe I want to write a paper saying, if you're driven by these kind of simplicity considerations, they ought to lead you to a sort of cosmopsychist view of the foundational mind. Okay, so they're the two areas really. One, what I'm more passionate about and what we'll disagree on is, I think the foundational mind must have limited powers to circumnavigate the problem of evil. Two, I would be inclined to say, and perhaps you agree on this, that the parsimony considerations lead to the idea that the foundational mind is the physical universe.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So it's interesting. I'm tempted to go to the place where we may disagree the most. That seems like the most interesting. But I want to sort of approach it by exploring how much we might actually agree. So as you're describing your methodology in terms of having the sort of simplest explanation that explains the data, I share your methodology. And in fact, actually, in pointing to this idea of God or this fundamental mind, and if I use the word God, I just mean minimally some kind of consciousness from which other things come, some sort of original creator or source consciousness, that if it sort of unfolds into the universe, that actually strikes me as in keeping with my own kind of journey in the last 3 or 4 years toward thinking of God's consciousness as more integrated into the universe. So let me just draw this out. I had in my notes like some different models. One of the models I've been thinking about is Panentheism, not exactly pantheism, but a panentheist model, where you have this sort of fundamental substance that has different forms. And it's interesting reading Carlo Rovelli's work. There's this book I read of his where he talks about the quantum field being fundamentally based in sort of states of information or abstraction, kind of like what you were suggesting in terms of sort of a mathematical base. And then that makes me think that matter itself is the very nature of matter may be fundamentally informational or in some sense or described in those terms. But then what is this information of? And it's like, well, minds are sort of a paradigm example of things that produce information. My early work in philosophy was on propositions. And so you can think of propositions as informational contents of thoughts, right? And so then if material reality bottoms out in informational structures, and the paradigm examples of informational structures are contents of thoughts, then I think, oh, well, maybe the very physical world just is sort of a manifestation of the conscious mind, or this foundational mind. So that would be a panentheist way of describing it. Another way is the cosmopsychist way that you were describing. And actually, I was thinking about, are these even fundamentally different? So maybe the difference is in terms of Merology, or parts and wholes. But the idea is that you have this cosmic mind as being the whole, and then we are parts that sort of are derived from the whole. So the whole is ontologically prior to the parts, instead of the parts being prior to the whole. But whether you have the panentheist model or this cosmos model, it seems that the mind is prior. It's more fundamental to everything else, and then everything else is sort of explained in terms of that mind, either as parts of it or as forms of it in the panentheist model. I'd say, I don't know, are the forms of it parts of it? See, that's where the theory of parts and wholes in my own mind, it's the vocabulary starts to break down. I'm not sure what to say. Maybe it depends on the philosopher I'm talking with, how to describe these things. But the simplicity considerations do move me in that direction, as well as sort of the analysis of science and physics. So this might actually be a point of unity still between us. And this is one of the things I really was itching to talk about when I read your paper, where you're articulating sort of this pathway through fine-tuning through a foundational mind. But you describe theism as this view that there's sort of the supernatural, categorically different, non-natural mind, sort of beyond the universe, that produces the universe. And so that is a characterization of theism. But then I was thinking, well, my own view is like, I'm happy to describe all of reality from top to bottom as categorically uniform, I think, in the way that you do. I'm not sure whether I want to say the cosmic mind is a whole prior to the parts, or whether it's sort of the substance out of which all other things participate or are forms of. And I still leave open the possibility of a kind of creation ex nihilo, from nothing. But I'm more attracted to this sort of categorical unity, where the universe is related to the conscious mind in a very intimate way, maybe in the way that we are related to our own bodies. Our bodies are sort of like external reflections of an intrinsic or internal conscious reality. And the universe, as we see it, is a kind of external geometric reflection of an internal conscious reality. So I'm not sure if we have a substantial disagreement there.
Yeah, I mean, just on you saying how I'm using the word God, it's interesting that I was talking about this new book I've just started, and I put the idea on Facebook, and I had the subtitle I'm currently thinking of is Exploring the Middle Ground Between God and Atheism.
Yeah.
And then I was talking about the book, and then
I like that.
Lots of my atheist friends said, well, this is just atheism. This is just an unusual kind of atheism. But then my sort of whitehead process theology friends said, well, this is just theism. This is just nonsense of theism. I said, perfect. That's exactly. So it's a view that, could perhaps be classed as both. So, yeah. So, I mean, I'm not too precious about how we use terms. And I tend to use terms to sort of, as I've already said, kind of provoke people or open people up. People who might be kind of have a big no on the word on God.
Well, if I may just interrupt, I just want to say I love how you use the terms, because what I see you doing is, in my own vocabulary, you're pointing to the true, the beautiful, and good in theism, but in atheistic friendly terms. So in a way, I feel like what you're doing is you're helping a certain audience see the treasures that I would see in a theistic worldview. And in a way, maybe pulling those treasures away from things that wouldn't be treasures. So it's sort of a way of seeing the purity of, okay, we're talking about like a mind. We're not saying that it's not physical. In fact, we can characterize it as physical. So putting it in those terms, I feel like it's very attractive. It helps you to engage the audience that you're engaging.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, people say, I don't believe in the old man in the sky, as if kind of anyone does believe that. But yeah, I mean, I suppose you're right. But whether it's appropriate to use the word God maybe depends on, as you say, if it's a panentheist view or a cosmopsychist view. So if it's God is identical with the universe and there's nothing. So I guess panentheism is there's more to the nature of God than the universe. So the universe is in some sense, and I appreciate there's different senses of part, whole, as you say, but
Yeah.
on panentheist, in some sense, the universe is part of God, but there's more to God. So I think that's a lot more consonant with a traditional Christian view. For example, my Catholic friends have told me that's not heretical, but pantheism is heretical. So if it's just the universe, though, then that starts to look a little bit less appropriate to the word God, and especially if it's a contingent being. So if I'm just thinking about accounting for fine tuning, then it might as well just be a contingent being that came into existence at the Big Bang and then fine tuned itself. So it depends what consideration.
Yeah.
But maybe just, I mean, to try and tease out on the first point, why do you do? I guess you do think, and why do you think that there must be more to the foundational mind than the universe?
Well, I
Why?
don't
Yeah, why
know
couldn't it?
actually.
Yeah,
I'm actually sort of undecided between. I like your articulation of the whole being prior to the parts, and the idea that the cosmic mind is the whole of reality. I don't feel like I have a clear grasp on these terms to rule that out. Um, I think that what happens is that people become so accustomed to a certain conceptual frame that certain articulations can feel like enemy or threats to that frame, but they're really not. So, for example, I mean, I've heard so many times that the idea that the universe is God, like that's like heresy. You can't believe that, you know. It's like, well, I want to just believe what's true, you know. So, so I'm just like thinking about this, and what's supposed to be heretical about it is the idea that you describe the creature as if it's actually the creator, and that's supposed to be, you know, basically a contradiction. But of course, that's not the view you're articulating. You're articulating a view in which there is a distinction between the parts and the whole. And I think most people, they're not swimming in the metaphysics of Merology to be thinking about like how maybe their frame can actually translate into this frame that's been described in their own traditions as an enemy frame. And kind of going the other way, you know, this sort of middle ground between the atheism and the theism, I find that, yeah, there are sort of views that are like considered to be an enemy to maybe naturalism. But then if you sort of enter into those views in the vocabulary of naturalism, it seems like now they can be okay, right? So my answer to your question is I don't feel like I have clear insight to decide between the sort of panentheist psychism and maybe sort of a creation ex nihilo. I'm moved by the simplicity considerations. I'd have to think more about whether it's simpler for there to be a kind of part whole relation that separates sort of dependent things from the foundational thing, versus having some kind of like form relation, like the sort of foundational substance is that out of which all other things are forms of. I mean, as I think about it right now, sort of parthood strikes me as a kind of primitive, simple term, but then like form of also seems sort of simple. And so if I have like two choices, like all of reality is either a fundamental mind or a form of a fundamental mind, or all of reality is either a fundamental mind or part of a fundamental mind, I don't know. I need help really to decide between those views. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, I suppose some people worry about understanding us as distinct from God, and maybe we're being parts of God. It depends what you're building into parts.
Part is not enough of a distinction.
I mean, what just seemed to me a straightforward simplicity gain is forget about us, the physical universe. You know, why say that God? It does seem to me, and I'm not totally sure on this, but less parsimonious to think that God created ex nihilo, this thing, the physical universe, distinct from herself, rather than just realizing that in her consciousness, you know?
Yeah.
So think of on the cosmopsychist view or some kind of panentheist relative, you just, you know, if you imagine describing the fundamental structure of the universe in the terms of fundamental physics, the fields with all particles, and I guess particles are naturally thought of as sort of vibrations in fields, but all that really complicated structure. If that structure is the structure of God's consciousness or part of God's consciousness, and so we can identify the universe with God's consciousness or that part of God's consciousness, that seems to me clearly a simplicity saving on God creating this different thing.
I agree.
Think.
Yeah. So I'm with you on that. That's one of the reasons I'm attracted to that view. Or
so you
something.
might have have a kind of, in terms of us, you might have a kind of, I've sometimes thought about a kind of overlap. If you're worried about us being distinct from, you could have a sort of overlap view where we are in some way distinct from God, but our consciousness overlaps with the consciousness that makes up the physical universe. Another issue here that I've written about actually is whether two different minds can share the same experiences. Me and a very good panpsychist philosopher, Luke Roloffs, have a forthcoming paper on this. That some people think that this doesn't make sense. Like, because could your headache and my headache be literally the same headache? Does that make sense? And I'm inclined to think it does. In which case, it could be that the physical universe is kind of the foundational mind's consciousness, and non-foundational minds overlap. Their consciousness overlaps with that. So my sensory consciousness. So suppose you think of the physical stuff in my brain, that is on this view would be an aspect of the foundational mind's consciousness, and then my mind, its sensory consciousness would be largely made up of that, made up of the foundational mind's consciousness. So we literally overlap. So maybe I've got some of my own thoughts and some of my own. If you're worried about free will, this is the main thing that presses people. If you're worried about free will, maybe you want our free will to be distinct from the free will of the foundational mind, but we could overlap in our consciousness. And so I think that's the route to a very parsimonious view of things.
I agree. I mean, there's a tradition of thinking in these terms. I'm just thinking of that line, "It is in him in whom we live and have our being." So St. Paul, one of the biblical writers, quotes that, and I believe that he got that from somebody prior, so he wasn't the originator of that. But this idea that it's the relationship between us and the original mind is more intimate, and that there's some simplicity advantages there. Now, I mean, I can see somebody maybe making an explanation argument for explaining things as far as we can, and that might provide some reason to think that, well, if we could explain the cosmos in terms of a deeper explanation, maybe that explanatory depth could overshadow the simplicity gain. But I don't actually take that view, because it seems to me that when I'm actually thinking about what I'm actually explaining, I go through the list of properties. So I'm trying to explain, let's say, contingencies. Now here we'll disagree, in that I do think that if we can explain contingencies in terms of something that's not itself contingent, that will be an explanatory advantage. But then I have no problem thinking, and I think you might even allow for this option of thinking of the sort of base of physical reality or the base of natural reality as itself non-contingent, as itself having a kind of necessary nature. And then I'm thinking, okay, I want to explain out limits and boundaries and quantities and shapes as far as I can. And so then that leads me to think that sort of fundamental reality is not sort of doesn't have these sort of arbitrary limits or boundaries or quantities, but that's still consistent with me thinking that the base of physical reality is that which is not arbitrarily limited, that which has necessary existence, that which has consciousness and all these properties. And so I think in the end, I think I want to join you in sort of this more immanent conception of consciousness with the rest of the cosmos. I'm sort of just undecided on whether I want to think of this as the whole that's prior to the parts, or whether kind of a base substance out of which all the parts are forms of.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
don't feel quite so sure. I mean, so I still allow for the possibility of creation ex nihilo, but I just want to immediately grant that that does add complexity to the theory. So that complexity would need to be paid for.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, so I think you can have both in a way. So your concern is that the fundamental explanatory entity is very simple in these ways. So put on one side for the moment the disagreement that I think it
Yeah,
can't
we'll
be as
come back
simple
to
as
that
you
one.
because of the problem of evil. But
Yeah.
putting that on one side, so I think you can, on the view I'm proposing, you could still say that. You could still say in terms of, I don't know, philosophers like to talk about grounding now, like the fundamental. This is not a causal relationship. The fundamental thing that grounds everything else, that could be this sort of limitless, simple mind. But that limitless, simple mind becomes the physical universe, and that's a sort of contingent state of it.
Yeah.
So you've got both. So you avoid the complexity of creation ex nihilo because the physical universe is not outside of the foundational mind, but at the same time you've still got so that's a kind of causal thing. So the universe sort of the foundational mind kind of caused itself to contingently be a physical universe, but at the same time, in terms of like grounding, you've still got a deeper explanatory story where it bottoms out in this limitless mind. So I think you can really gain both savings here. It's not like
Yeah. You might
yeah.
be. That did actually occur to me. Maybe I could have both. They're not necessarily competing hypotheses. But
I think so.
one thing, if I may just add in here, is that I'm not really sure what like the physical universe refers to, and I think this might just be a vocabulary problem. But like, I have a similar question about brains. So, if I think of a brain and I think of it describable fundamentally in terms of geometric features, like it's got a shape, and then there's like motion, there's extension and spatial relations. Then it seems like that's the wrong kind of thing to be the subject of consciousness. But if instead I think of the geometric features as a kind of reflection of an underlying substance or an underlying thing that is itself intrinsically conscious, whereas the features we see about the brain are more like extrinsic manifestations of that consciousness, well, then I have no problem saying that the brains are conscious. So I would say something the same with the universe. So like if I think of the universe, and I think many people have this kind of image of the universe as sort of fundamentally sort of this geometric thing. And I understand physicists are saying it's fundamentally transcends space. So I'm aware of that. But if instead the universe is just describable in terms of its geometry and spatial relations, then I have kind of the same response. I don't think that's the right kind of thing to be a subject of consciousness. But if instead we open it up, and I think this is what you're pointing to, Philip, is that the geometric features are actually the geometric and quantitative features that physicists study are not the fundamental features. They're more like kind of windows into an extrinsic window into an interior subjective consciousness. And then I really just don't have a problem with the language of saying that this sort of fundamental consciousness is the universe, so long as the word the universe doesn't refer fundamentally to geometric quantitative features.
Yeah, I used to be a big fan of Marcus Borg, this sort of very liberal Christian guy who called himself a panentheist. And actually, you're making me think when you had that line from St. Paul, he had a lot of good lines from the Bible that he thought suggested something panentheistic. Like, and I mean, all the talk of sort of the glory of God filling the earth, you know, and he thought his own mystical experiences were suggestive of this.
Yeah, that's the mystical experiences. Yeah,
But
yeah.
He wanted to call himself a panentheist rather than a pantheist, but that's because he was thinking pantheism is just the physical universe as described from physics, and physics gives us its nature. And then it's a kind of pantheism where it's just like you have the metaphysics of Richard Dawkins, but you have a sort of worshipful attitude to the universe or something. But that's not what we're talking about here, right? It's like, you know, physics is just mathematics, and that's so abstract. So it's not really telling us the nature of the thing. So yeah, I mean, if you just think like your own visual field is in some sense extended, and has a sort of geometrical shape. So the idea would be it would be like that. It's just the foundational mind's consciousness has this kind of extension in some sense.
That's it. That's pretty much how I think of it. Yeah.
And is filled out in these ways, and there's something that, and that realizes the mathematical structure is picked up by physicists. Just before, I guess we're gonna have to move on to the point of major screen, but just on this point, so your line of argument is that where you have complexity, it needs some explanation, right? So if the foundational minds had these limits, then they would require explanation. It requires less explanation if it's limitless. Now, I think that sounds good, but I would want to say, and I want to know, I couldn't quite get the answer to this from reading your stuff. I want to know if you agree.
Yeah.
I would want to say even the limitless mind still needs to be some explanation there as to why it exists at all, as opposed to not existing. Why. So maybe it needs less of an explanation than a limited thing, but there still needs to be some explanation there. Or do you think it just totally removes the need for explanation?
I like explaining things as far as we can, and I don't think merely removing limits by itself is going to remove all possible reasons to think that there would be a further explanation. In fact, if it were unlimited and contingent, it seems to me that there could still be a further explanation in terms of something that's not contingent. That indeterministically results in the contingent state. So yeah, I think that merely being unlimited wouldn't stop the explanatory chain. It's just
right.
The way I see it is there's certain things that sort of call for an explanation. So if I see a turtle, I think that calls for an explanation. And then if there's something that's shaped like a turtle but different, has maybe more vertices or something, I don't think a difference in vertices is going to be a relevant difference. And so then I think about relevant differences and think, it seems like no difference in mere shape is relevant to having an explanation. So I have a kind of a principle of uniformity applied to limits, right? Then I have the same thing applied to contingent things. And this leads me to think that ultimate reality is non-contingent and non-limited. Now, to say it's not limited doesn't thereby mean it's infinite, because maybe it doesn't have degreed attributes at the fundamental level. Like maybe it's like purely good and purely powerful and maybe purely aware or something. But it's not that like it's got goodness to an infinite degree. That might not come in degrees like that. It might just be good and then not also quantitatively good, if that makes sense, but more like a quality.
That's really interesting. So, but just to pin it down a little bit more, so take the foundational mind that you defend as we understand it. Do you think that calls out for explanation at all? So I realize, I see what you're saying, like a turtle with very specific spatial feet. That seems to really call out for explanation, and the foundational mind that you're describing seems less to call out for explanation. But does it call out for explanation at all?
So let's say it's a perfect mind. And let's say a perfect mind is a mind that's purely positive in the sense that all of its basic attributes are value contributing. Then I'm not sure if I want to say that its perfection sort of explains its necessary existence. Like it's because it's perfect that we can see that it would have perfection across all possible worlds. Like that's the kind of thing a perfect thing would be. It's too great to be limited to just some worlds. Like it's going to be foundational to all the worlds.
Oh yeah, okay.
So that's one sort of way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is because it's perfect, it's the kind of thing that no longer needs an explanation. So it's not the kind of thing that really could be further explained, because any further explanation would then sort of deplete it from its complete perfection. It would make it a dependent thing.
Right.
So I kind of go one of those two ways. I'm not sure between them, that like either perfection sort of explains its necessary existence, or perfection is sort of a reason to stop the explanatory chain. And anything that's less than perfect still has some limit or boundary with respect to its value that calls for further explanation. And so there's a kind of explanatory advantage explaining things as far as we can.
Brilliant. Can I? Sorry,
Hey,
Kyle.
No, yeah. I was
can
just going to ask
yeah.
Josh because I wanted to help clarify what Josh is saying. So, Josh, what you're saying is that if God could be explained, so if a perfect mind could be explained, whatever explains it is just going to be more of God, basically. Like whatever atheists ask who created God. Well, it's like if we could answer that question, it would just be more God. Is that what you're trying to get at, or?
Yeah, maybe whatever that sort of foundational reality is, if it's perfect, then that perfection is sort of the kind of attribute that is either a flag for no further explanation is possible, or it's actually in a way like an explanation of its necessary existence.
Yeah. Just that's really good what you've said there, and I think it maybe points to another point of disagreement. So I don't buy ontological arguments, and probably be too much to go into that. But and I don't think I'd buy the second approach you suggested for, getting rid of explanation altogether. So the way I see it, I mean, I think everything we understand cries out for explanation to some degree.
Yeah.
So what do we do with this? I'm inclined to think ultimately there must be a self-explainer. There must be something that somehow explains its own existence, but we just have no positive conception of such a thing. So, I mean, to get clearer on that, I think we do have a positive conception of the polar opposite, an impossible being, something whose nature makes it impossible. So square circles, you understand, you just think about a square circle, you see by the light of reason, I know you like that phrase, you see that it just can't, by its nature, it can't exist. And so a self-explainer would be something with a nature that when you reflect on it, you say, oh, that just has to exist. Now, my view is there probably is such a thing. So I'm sympathetic enough to the cosmological argument type considerations to think, there must be an explanation, an ultimate explanation. There must be such a thing. But I think we just have no positive understanding of how of the kind of nature that could explain its own existence. So just like dogs can't do mathematics, I think we just have human minds can't conceive of a nature that could explain its own existence. So I guess you're more tempted to think actually we can understand something where explanations come to an end. Whereas I think there must be something, but we just have no understanding of it. And I think that's important for the disagreement between us more generally, because that's why I'm less bothered if the foundational mind is somewhat complex, is somewhat non-simple. Mm-hmm. Better if it's as simple as possible, because okay, there's going to be things that cry out for explanation, but I think everything we understand cries out for explanation, and there will be an explanation in terms of its positive nature, but that just goes beyond what human beings are capable of understanding. So, do you see? Whereas I think you're thinking, no, we need to get to this totally simple thing that such that we can understand how it explains its own existence. Whereas I think that's just impossible. So I'm happy to stop at something that's not.
Yeah. Looks like you just froze. Okay, you're back. Yeah, I like how you put that. We're going to get to the problem of evil in just a minute, but I'm too curious here. So I'm thinking about maybe a bridge that brings these together a little bit. So I like what you say about things calling for an explanation. And so this could be a reason to think that some original reality, whatever it is, who knows what it is, maybe explains itself in some way, or maybe it's in some way an exception to this rule. And then what I hear you saying is that you're skeptical that we have sort of insight into the kind of nature that would explain itself. And it's interesting because it does seem like at least we maybe have insights into the kinds of natures that don't explain themselves. So like a turtle nature. And I mentioned the turtle nature because for me, that's what leads me into this principle that mere differences in shape aren't relevant differences, because it strikes me as kind of clear by the light of reason that shapes don't explain themselves. So that the fundamental description of fundamental reality won't be in terms of geometry. If fundamental reality is self-explaining, then I'm going to sort of join you and say, okay, let's say fundamental reality is self-explaining. Then let's say we have insight into certain things that are not self-explaining. Then at least perhaps we can make some progress by subtracting some characterizations of fundamental reality while leaving open what the positive characterization could be. It's like maybe a visual metaphor for me is like I'm pulling away dirt and rubble and things that can't be self-explaining. And then once I pull that all away, okay, it's not shape, it's not, contingent. It's like I pull that all away, and then it's almost like what remains. And then I have this idea, oh, it's a purely positive nature. And I can maybe see how a purely positive nature would predict necessary existence. This isn't exactly an ontological argument because I'm not having as a premise that a purely positive nature is possible and therefore actual, but rather that a purely positive nature would, if it were actual, seem to me to be the kind of nature that would span all the possible worlds and be perhaps self-explaining or stop the explanation chain. But put that aside. So let's say we don't have any insight into the positive nature of a self-explaining reality or an ultimate reality. Still, do you think that we could say something sort of by subtraction, sort of removing, it's not a turtle because turtles aren't self-explaining, right? And by the same reason, it's not, any other, let's say, fundamentally geometric object, but would be something sort of deeper in.
Brilliant. I like. I think. Sorry, we just keep complimenting each other, but I think actually you've made me think a clear idea of where we're disagreeing. So, and I had to think about that for a second to think. Oh, actually, am I being persuaded? But so I guess I think that the foundational thing could be like a turtle,
Okay.
right? And from our perspective, what we know about a turtle, it cries out for explanation. But if it is the self-explainer, once you grasp that self-explaining nature that goes totally beyond human comprehension, if you could grasp it, you just see, it has to have that exact shape. Wow.
Okay, I might be able to join you here, Philip.
Yeah.
This may surprise you. So I think I might be able to join you that the fundamental reality could have the shape of a turtle. It's just that its turtle shape wouldn't be the self-explaining nature of that fundamental reality.
Good.
So the turtle shape would emerge. It's sort of like, as you say, the universe sort of emerges from the fundamental reality, and its fundamental nature, whatever it is, that's self-explaining, is not characterized in terms of a turtle, even if it is a turtle, even if it sort of evolves into a turtle shape. See, this then allows that imminence.
Very interesting distinction. I might just have to have a think about that. I suppose even if I could concede that it still could be that the self-explainer, because of its self-explaining nature that goes beyond our comprehension, necessarily ends up having certain complexity, certain limitations.
I allow for that. Yeah.
So we could still get to my limited foundational mind, but that I think I'll just have to think more about well,
this actually provides a nice segue, I think, to our sort of largest point of tension on the problem of evil, because I was very curious to explore with you sort of the explanation of the constraints on its power. So it sounds like we have some interesting agreement, at least as a working hypothesis, that there is a fundamental reality. It has some kind of powers of mentality, and it's good, at least in some sense of good. And then there's a question about so how much sort of power does it have, right? And it seems to me that its powers would actually be limited by the basic rules of reality. So in your paper, you talk about the laws of physics, and if the laws of physics are describing the basic rules of reality, then I would agree, actually, even here, that the sort of fundamental consciousness would be constrained by these rules of reality. And then sort of the way that I think about it is that the rules of reality are themselves perhaps grounded in the nature of the fundamental reality, or if they're not grounded in the nature, maybe they're ungrounded rules somehow, then the totality of all the rules together sort of is part of sort of how I would think of fundamental reality in its totality, because if the laws are fundamental, then they're part of fundamental reality. So either way, fundamental reality in its totality has certain constraints by like what it is, by what its laws are. And then that's going to, in a sense, constrain its powers. But then by my desire to shave off arbitrary limits and explain them as far as I can, I'm going to think that these limits in power aren't fundamental, but instead are sort of springing out of more basic aspects. But then this can actually maybe help with the problem of evil, because then this could explain why there are certain constraints in the kind of world that can unfold. Even what you suggested earlier about reality sort of starts very small. My wife and I have talked about this. Actually, it's one of our hypotheses that like there's no, we call it the no skipping hypothesis, that there can't just be like skips in reality. So you can't just have any reality like just produce another reality without some kind of continuity. And so that even like the beginning of a geometric reality maybe starts small, although maybe the geometry of our mental images provide counterexamples to that. I'm not sure if you want to call that phenomenal geometry, but the idea is that there might be some basic rules of reality that are just part of the nature of the foundation, and if they're limited, then they're not fundamental by my argument from explaining limits, but they might still be necessary byproducts of something fundamental, per your thought about maybe the shape is a necessary consequence. It could be necessary, it could be maybe indeterministically produced, but even just allowing, for sake of argument, that could be a necessary consequence, then that might explain at least some sort of why there may be some boundaries or limitations of a fundamental mind that would, in my terms, still be purely positive and unlimited, having no limit in its power in its most fundamental description, if that makes sense, even if there are limits that grow out of its nature.
Yeah.
Like it'd be limited by the laws of logic, for example, which are like part of the necessary rules.
Yes. Yes. So now I think about it a bit more, I think I do want to still disagree with you on the... So you've got this push to think what's at the base must be totally simple, have no arbitrary limitations. I think because I think we just don't understand at all self-explaining nature, I think it could be that what is at the very base is a turtle, you know, and that seems like, what? How can a turtle be? But that's just because we don't understand self-explaining nature. So I want to say not only that the turtle nature arises and is a property of the fundamental thing, but it's just at the base as well. And so I share your drive for simplicity. I share your drive for simplicity, but to me, it's purely about probability, like simpler, like in a normal scientific sense, simpler hypotheses are more probable. But if the evidence pushes us towards a more complicated one, then we don't have to have simplicity at the very bottom. I think from what you just said, there's still going to be simplicity at the very bottom, but some limitations might arise from that. I want to say, no, there could be just certain kinds of complexity and arbitrariness at the very bottom. I'm kind of happy with that.
Hey, Philip, I have a question, just a clarifying question. So would you say that the cosmic mind is constrained by like there's physical constraints on the cosmic mind, and so that's why, we live in this sort of universe with the physics that it has?
Kind of, but when you say constrained, that almost sounds as if there's something outside it holding it back. But the thought, the foundational mind is the foundational thing. The thought is it's just not all powerful. So I guess I don't share, because I don't share Josh's drive to think the foundational thing must be utterly simple. I think it might just just have these limitations, and that's
Okay.
yeah.
And then
So
Josh, so my similar question to
Yeah.
you, except for your hypothesis, would you say that God has not physical constraints, but actually logical constraints? So constraints on value, and so that sort of helps to explain why there's certain evils in the world.
Yes, and also metaphysical constraints, just like what the basic rules of its nature are, or even just the basic rules of logic, for example, would provide metaphysical constraints. Again, it's not maybe a constraint from outside, but constraints from within.
Okay.
I do want to
Yeah.
clarify that my drive to think that it wouldn't have these sort of arbitrary limits isn't just a simplicity consideration. And I'm not thinking of it as a simple being as much as I want the simplest theory. But here, for me, there's a kind of explanatory consideration. So, and in here, I feel like maybe my disagreement with you, Philip, is actually sharp and with conviction. That like I feel quite convinced that on this one point that a turtle shape, that's not a self-explaining nature. It might be grounded in a self-explaining nature. I'm going to allow that. But the turtle shape just, it's like, no, my mind says no to that. And so, and that I'm at rock bottom. I can't hardly argue for that. I can just like point to examples and say, just changing the shape's not going to be relevant to whether it happens to be self-explanatory. And there are some shapes that I think are evidently not self-explanatory.
I agree the turtle shape isn't itself a self-explaining property. My thought is it might be a fundamental property of the self-explaining thing, or maybe I'm losing this grip of this distinction again now.
Okay, I can allow for that. Yeah. So
Yeah?
it isn't.
Oh, we're agreeing again now. That's no good.
Well, this is interesting exploration for me. So maybe I'm less comfortable with self-explaining. I sort of think of explanation as asymmetric, but maybe there's a way of interpreting it. So I can go with it. I mean, even I talked about perfection as sort of explaining its necessary existence. So what I hear you suggesting is maybe it could have a cluster of fundamental properties, which aren't flags for its self-explaining nature, but there's some other property that is a flag for its self-explaining nature, and we don't know what that is. We don't have a positive grasp of it. And then our point of agreement would then be, so this is good because it seems like usually if there's a conviction, then and two people have a conviction, they go in opposite directions. Usually there's like truth kind of between them. So I think what I'm seeing as our overlap is that the turtle shape wouldn't in and of itself be the self-explaining nature, even if it were a fundamental feature of something that has a self-explaining nature.
Yeah. That sounds right. So yeah, I just think we just, it's like I think your view is that we have some grasp on the you don't want to use the word self-explaining, but the thing that doesn't need to be explained, whereas I think we just have no grip on that. So it could entail that it necessarily has a turtle shape.
Mm-hmm.
And so
what about value? Could you see value as playing a role, like it's sort of maximally valuable or maximally impressive reality?
I think I feel the same way, that I think it's simpler if it's gonna be an entity that responds to value at all. I think it's simpler to be perfectly good, and this is why, I mean, I've just written this review of Tim Mulgan's interesting book Purpose in the Universe, where he argues for an indifferent God. Similar motivations to me, on the one hand fine tuning, on the other hand problem of evil. I come to the conclusion that the best hypothesis for explaining both of them is a God of limited powers. He comes up with an indifferent God, or so. I mean, a lot of people, or just when I raise this God of limited powers, a lot of people say, "Oh, what about an evil God, or a not perfectly good God?" But I think that is going to get more complicated, because I think you've got to think, well, if it's an evil God, you get a kind of problem of the good, or it might just be a God who's just pretty indifferent to suffering and, creating universes, try them out. But I think you inevitably get quite a complex psychology there, that it's sort of partly cares about value, but is sort of indifferent. And whereas I think if it's just perfectly good, but slightly limited powers in a way that's easy to I think it's much simpler to specify the kind of limitations to power that I talked about than it is to specify a really complicated psychology that's not perfectly good. So yeah, so again, it's just simplicity. So it could be that the foundational thing is a sort of complex psychological thing that is sort of a bit of a bastard, but not perfect, not totally evil. But I'm choosing between hypotheses. I'm going to go for the simplest one, and the god of the foundational mind of limited powers seems to me simpler than a god who's a bit of a bastard.
So you guys did agree an hour and 30 minutes. So the last 15 minutes, you guys want to discuss the problem of evil. We can get into that.
I think we're right there. I think we've been building our resources so we can talk about it with greater light, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's interesting, even Philip, as you were just describing these competing models, you have this model where fundamental reality is like completely good or just partially good. And then you have a model of it's like completely powerful or like limited in power. And even there, I think there's some overlap in that. I'm going to grant that it's going to have limits to its power, which are limited in terms of its more basic nature, like limits in terms of the laws of logic or the rules of the necessary rules of reality, and rules of maybe there's necessary rules of psychology and necessary rules of value. And then there's this model where it's right, it's like completely powerful and completely good. So you have the limited power, the limited goodness, right? And I guess you could have limited both and unlimited. Okay, so anyway, so those are all the different models, and we're thinking about the theoretical costs. I wrote down in my notes, I was thinking about the problem of evil, and I think my biggest kind of 2 points. One was I just wanted to draw attention to this overlap that we both would think that fundamental reality, that there are rules of reality that would, in a sense, constrain its powers. And I think that could maybe explain some of the things. And then the other thing was I wanted to draw out kind of an optimistic possibility. So I wrote down, let me find this in my notes. So I have this logical point. So I say, if there are moral constraints on what if there are moral constraints on what a good God could do, or good being, or whatever could do, then probably if a good God exists, then God created within those constraints. Okay, now we might have evidence against that, but I wrote down some possible constraints. I have 4 constraints. These are leaning into an optimistic vision. So in a way, holding the bar high for a good being with unlimited powers. Like, here's what I would want to be the case, or what I would hope. If it's purely good, it has all the powers, here's what I think maybe it should be able to pull off. So I have 4 ideas. So, and these aren't the only ones, but these are maybe, let's say, minimum constraints on an optimistic view of reality. So first, I call it the big picture constraint. So every life, every individual being that experiences consciousness, its total life will, on the whole, be good. That is more positive than negative. Now, you might think, well, this is disconfirmed. There's beings that, they suffer and then they die prematurely. But then I have another constraint, which I call it's not over, or the episodes constraint. So the way I state this is there's no ultimate tragedy, but instead every negative part can be an ingredient to something else. And in many of the traditions, and including in near-death experiences, there's reports of this idea of souls coming into the earth and experiencing a certain kind of consciousness that's meaningful and unique to that state of limitation. And so there's this idea of a narrative structure of the world where the whole world sort of unfolds with meaningful episodes, episodes within episodes of larger stories. So I call it the it's not over constraint, that there's no ultimate tragedy for any being. So that would be optimistic if that were true. The greater good constraint. So every negative part or every negative experience, it may not be, in a sense, like necessary to achieve some greater good, but it is something that is essentially connected to certain greater goods. So every negative experience works for a greater good, where the meaning of the good is tied to the experience. So, for example, before I met my wife, Rachel, I had certain negative experiences of relationships and heartaches and hopes and desires. And then those experiences contribute to a very specific kind of appreciation and connection with Rachel that I continue to feel today. Like there's a meaning to my relationship with her that's forged by this history. And again, it's not to say that the negative experiences make this worth it, but just that as a minimum constraint, I would think that all the negative can be part of some greater good. And then number 4, I call this choice. So I say beings enter into states of limitation by choice or by consent, knowing the risks and the potential benefits. Or if they don't make a choice, then they would make that choice if it were available to them. So in some traditions, the idea is like souls are, let's say, forms of or products of this sort of original consciousness, and then they come into this world adventure where they experience certain risks for the sake of certain kinds of relationships, maybe learning lessons of love in trials, and then those lessons get built into the experience of the soul, and then when they come back out, they have the experience of returning home to where they came from. And they can choose to go back again. They take into account the risks. Or if they don't take into account the risks, then the idea is if they were to take into account the risks, they would choose it given the benefits. Okay, so those are my 4 constraints. Now you might think, well, that's a very optimistic view. Like everything works for greater good. Anything negative is something that beings would sort of choose, at least in principle, the sort of risk of that. There's no ultimate tragedies. That's very exciting. But I want to say kind of like 2 thoughts about that. Like, so on the one hand, it seems like it's the kind of exciting thing that maybe, Philip, you're thinking that an all-powerful being that's also perfectly good maybe would go for. Like there would be high constraints for what kind of a world. Like every life would be on the whole positive. Everything negative is part of a greater story. There's no ultimate tragedies, etc. But then on the other hand, and this is where I just like have misty eyes, right? Like I don't see clearly from looking at nature and looking at interactions between beings that reality isn't unfolding within those constraints. And maybe the problem is that my own sort of assessment is colored by not just simplicity considerations or something, but like it's colored by a whole range of experiences, and I can't even tell you what they all are, but these include these thousands of near-death experience reports from different cultures where they have a kind of core theme, and it seems like that core theme fits this general worldview of a fundamental consciousness, and there being purposes. Beings come into states of limitation for greater experiences, that those experiences don't just benefit the creatures, but even benefit the original consciousness. The original consciousness is also, maybe through overlapping experiences with us, gaining jewels of appreciation of various kinds of goods that would otherwise be impossible. So, I mean, that's kind of a sketch there. I don't know.
Yeah.
Feel free to
Can I
chime in
just,
here.
that was really beautiful. Can I just clarify, put a point there? Do you believe we existed before birth? That seemed to be part of your story, that we chose?
So that would be a model that would be consistent with the choice constraint, but it's not required for the constraint. The other option is it's just a counterfactual. If given the choice, we would make the choice.
I see.
I mean, I'll just be honest. I am impressed by these NDE reports where people have the experience of returning home. I've seen many of them where they say not just they return home, but they actually saw a contract of an agreement that they made to come to the earth, and they describe what that's like. And again, these are often against their own cultural and religious expectations.
Right.
It's almost like one of those topics where it's against the expectations of my own home religious community. So it's like if I talk about these things, like some people in my community are like, oh, you should be believing that, but it looks like it is something that these experiences
Yeah.
are pointing to. So I allow this for at least a hypothetical.
Yeah, so I mean, I would never say that evil and suffering rules out for certain an all-powerful God. And I mean, maybe this is an important part of why I don't feel much push towards thinking God is all-powerful. I think there's something of a simplicity advantage, but I don't think that counts for much in my view. I mean, this is why Swinburne's point of the speed of light is a good one. Yeah, okay, maybe in some sense the default hypothesis of the speed of light is that it's infinitely quick, but it doesn't take much evidence to counterbalance that. So in the same way, even though I think in some way an all-powerful God is more simple, I don't really think there's like a really strong consideration. I put this to Richard Swinburne at the British Society for the Philosophy of Religion a couple of years ago, and then his view, he said, well, he now thinks evil is absolutely no evidence against God, which is different to what he says in the existence of God. But anyway, so I just think it could be, there's some possibility that all those constraints are satisfied, but it just seems to me pretty unlikely. And that the best way to create life is through evolution by natural selection, and particularly some of the horrific things we find in nature. It just seems pretty improbable that there's some greater good that could justify that. And I mean, here's one thing. I mean, I really like that, the beautiful way. I mean, I read it in your dialogue book as well, that you put your theodicy, but I kind of counterpoint. I sometimes an analogy I give in my problem of evil lectures to secondary undergraduates is, so suppose, look, suppose there are, I mean, it does seem plausible that there are some significant goods that exist in a world with evil and suffering that wouldn't exist in a more powerful world if we were all angels, right? Like, courage and adventure, the things you're talking about, scientific discovery. But it seems to me like those goods are massively lessened, made massively less, if they were sort of artificially put there by God to give us challenges, to give us hoops to jump through. I mean, I'm putting this in a loaded way that you obviously could dispute, but like, so here's my analogy I give in my class. Like, suppose I'm walking home from work and I see a house on fire, and there's a baby crying in one of the windows up there, and I bravely climb up the lamppost and jump in the window and rescue the baby, and what a wonderful thing to do. But then someone comes out and says, a camera crew comes out and says, "Oh, you did well," and it was a game show, and they'd set it up to see if I could meet the challenge, and suddenly it all seems a bit, really less than it, much less of a good than it was.
Yeah.
Or if I achieve some great scientific discovery, but then I find out I'm in some dystopian society where we'd already discovered all the scientific truths and we wiped our memories so we could have the challenge of finding them out again. That seems like massively lessens it. And to my mind, that's pretty analogous to what God is doing in the kind of theodicy you envisage, sort of artificially limiting us to create these challenges. And yeah, what do you think
Well,
about?
yeah, that's why I added the choice constraint in there as well. So I wanted to actually raise the bar, and say it takes even more. The beings themselves would
We have
come
to
in it.
choose.
I mean, it is interesting that we do voluntarily limit ourselves to states and limitation when we play certain kinds of games. There are real-time strategy games that I like to play, and I was just thinking about, like, I'm purposely limiting myself to this experience of shapes that's very limited and constrained for certain kinds of experiences, and if you think of sort of consciousness as sort of what matters most, then those experiences that you're having in these states of limitation can have real meaning for you. And now, this isn't to explain all the evils or anything like this. I think there can also be real constraints due to the basic laws of reality, as well as you pointed to. But I wanted to just note here that when I came up with those constraints, it wasn't sort of like this ad hoc additional complexity to my theory. Rather, I was just thinking like, okay, let's just raise the bar of our expectation on God like as high as we can, and let's just think through the light of moral reason, what we might expect sort of a being with unlimited powers and resources to aim for if it's perfectly good. And then that's where I came up with those constraints. And then I'm asking myself, does it look to me that sort of the natural world shows signs that those constraints aren't in fact met? And that's where that's not an easy question, but kind of this other thought that I wanted to throw out there is that when I'm thinking about evolution, I'm not thinking of it as a means of creating life, but rather as a product of a certain kind of life that's created. So if you create complex adaptive systems, that is, life forms that can replicate, but then also can replicate with variation, and if you do that in a world where there's meaningful choice and stochastic or non-deterministic processes, then that's going to result in a process of evolution, almost like as a logical consequence of creating that kind of being. Now, it doesn't thereby mean that there's going to be all the suffering that we find, but it's not the evolution per se that I'm thinking is producing the suffering. It's rather certain kinds of variations within the states of limitation, sort of like in, I hate to use the phrase, but like in a game or in a simulation where you go into this place knowing that there's risks of certain kinds of negative experiences. Now, what are the limits of the horrors that you would voluntarily subject yourself to? Maybe there are certain limits nobody would, and so you witness an event and you think, yeah, that wouldn't be something that beings would come into, knowing that there was a risk of that. And so I'm sympathetic to that. I'm not suggesting that there can be no empirical evidence that sort of weighs against the fundamental reality having, meeting these constraints. But just that I'm not thinking of it like God had a choice between creating via evolution versus creating via special creation. I'm thinking that evolution is a logical consequence of creating the kinds of organisms that are able to be in a complex adaptive system that can replicate, that can have children, that can have relationships with, their offspring in various forms and shapes. And so I'm not thinking of that as like, I guess maybe there is a choice about whether to create those kinds of beings, that kind of environment. Maybe it would be better just to create angels that just experience each other's love, right? But then I wonder, just think about this, Philip. Like, if that's what God does, like, how long are those angels going to be in the state of like, we love each other. Okay, it's time for some adventure. Let's create a world. And the angels get to work in creating like these simulations, and they go further and further and further in their work until eventually, they create these very elaborate ones where they pop into these bodies. They come through the embryonic portals to experience, the human event, or, the event of giraffes, or, whatever. So I don't know. It's, I guess for me, I have misty eyes. It's hard for me to, misty eyes, that's maybe not the right word. What I'm not crying. What I mean is it's hard for me to see through the mist of complexity. I'm not seeing my way through. I guess, to be honest, like, it does seem plausible that those constraints are met.
Maybe I'll just have one. Getting a bit later, so maybe I'll just have one last go at this, and then you can have the last word. What you're saying then sounds a bit like my friend Hedda Hasselmerk, another great panpsychist philosopher, is a pandeist, which is nothing. Someone was saying is that God is a panda, but it's which is that the universe used to be God and voluntarily gave up being God because it was sort of bored, needed some adventure, and then will eventually come back to being God. And she has an interview in Scientific American if people want to Google that. touches on this topic at the end. But I find that kind of miserable and depressing, actually. That like this is all about just having a game because we were too bored of perfection. I thought, I thought they had it. If God is kind of infinite, if the foundational mind is infinite, you can spend eternity getting deeper into those depths. I mean, would there be time?
I'm with you on that.
But
I
but
think you could,
just to press final challenge. And so in terms of, I'm really interested in this like choice thing. I suppose just two things. This choice thing, either that we before birth we got to choose this existence, or that we would have. I mean, how do we think about that in terms of very simple non-human animals? And I mean, the kind of specifically the kinds of example, the guy you had a dialogue with pressing, these creatures who paralyze their prey and then eat it alive, or what, or even just like an ant. What are we having these creatures choosing to be an ant or something? So I'm curious about that, but also, of course, human beings that just have terrible, unfortunate lives, live 3 years in chronic agony, and that I mean, what's the idea that they sort of chose this, or did they, or do you choose and it's a gamble where you'll end up? But I mean, yeah. So I'm struggling to see why, maybe you choose to be Mozart or something, but why would you choose to be a weevil or a human with a short, very bad existence? And you can definitely have the last word. I'll leave it there. And there's lots.
No, I just want to say those are wonderful questions. I don't have easy answers to those questions. So for the last word, I just want to say that I've just absolutely loved this conversation with you, Philip. This has been so much fun. I've been really enjoying reading your work. I've been learning a lot from you. And so I just want to thank you for this time. I feel like it felt to me like we were making a kind of dialectical progress in terms of sort of what's at stake, how we can think about simplicity and explanatory depth, and sort of sorting through relevant considerations. I felt like we were tracking each other very well. I feel like that's the kind of conversation that leads to new insights for me. I think hopefully for those listening as well. So thank you for this.
Oh, thanks, Josh. Well, I feel totally the same. I mean, and I've enjoyed reading your work and listening to you on other podcasts, and way of just writing and speaking very beautifully as well. And I share this desire to have productive conversations instead of trying to beat each other down. And yeah, brilliant. I hope we can continue the discussion and find out what you think about the weevils.
Sounds great.
All right, it was a good discussion, guys. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to questions today because I know we agreed to. Any closing thoughts, or like, what are you guys both working on in terms of philosophy? And then we'll close off.
Go ahead.
Well, I've got a term research leave, so I'm trying to write another trade book, another book aimed at general audience on the purpose of existence. So sort of arguing against God or the traditional omni-God, but also arguing that there is some kind of teleology in the universe on kind of fine-tuning grounds, moral grounds, and so developing various hypotheses for accounting for that. So I'm hoping to get a draft of that by Easter before I have to go back to teaching, and then I think I want to spend longer writing another academic book after that, which will probably take ages and be very painful. But yeah, sorry, I don't have time to hang around for answer questions. I think it's going to take me a long time to wind down from this.
No, you're good.
Stimulating discussion, and my kids wake me up at 6 a.m. So, but that's all.
All right. Hey, Josh,
my project now is a book on consciousness, the nature and origin of persons, and my big thesis, I cite you, Philip, as an ally in arguing for the thesis that mentality is a sort of fundamental feature of reality. And so I'm working on that every day, getting some feedback on it. And it's been a lot of fun, but that's my main project. And that will hopefully come out perhaps early next year.
Fantastic.
Nice.
Just say as well, I guess I could say my website, philipgoff.philosophy.com. Other stuff on it, or I argue a lot on Twitter, Philip_Goff, if you want to argue on Twitter.
And Mind Chat, your show there, it's wonderful.
Oh yeah, God, I keep forgetting to plug things. Yeah, Mind Chat is my podcast that I have with Keith Frankish, who has the polar opposite view to me. He doesn't believe in consciousness. And so I think consciousness is everywhere. He thinks it's nowhere. And we interview various philosophers and scientists. David Chalmers we're interviewing later in the month about his new book on virtual reality. Yeah, thanks for reminding me to plug that.
All right. Thanks, guys, for watching, and have a nice day.
Thanks so much for inviting us, Kyle, as well. That's really...
No problem. Thanks for coming on.